Hello, this is Fiona, one of the co-hosts of the DM's Book Club, a weekly book club podcast where we read about some Dungeons & Dragons and discuss how we might include it in our role-playing campaigns. In this episode, I got a chance to talk to freelance game designer, author and professional DM Kat Kruger about her latest work, How to Be More D&D, Face Your Dragons, Be More Adventurous, and Live Your Best Geeky Life. Kat has an incredible list of gaming and writing credits to her name, having worked for Hasbro, Wizard of the Coast, and Larian Studios. In the tabletop world, Kat is best known as the Dungeon Master on the family-friendly actual play podcast D20 Dames. Their newest campaign, Wanderleaf, just started earlier this year, and I can highly recommend checking it out, especially if you've got younger players at the table who want to play. How to Be More D&D invites fantasy lovers and fans of Dungeons & Dragons to celebrate and incorporate different elements of this iconic tabletop game into their lives. Published by Running Press, readers will learn how to take the skills, knowledge, and sense of adventure from their D&D campaigns to help them better understand everything, from how they interact with the world around them to facing the random events that life sometimes throws at us. Whether it's building your real-life character, discovering your ideal class and strengths, or simply using role-playing techniques to your advantage, How to Be More D&D explores how to enjoy the campaign known as life, and is the perfect gift for any tabletop gamer or D&D fan. Honestly, How to Be More D&D is a brilliant read, and one which I thoroughly enjoyed reading over and over again. And it was an absolute blast to talk to Kat about her work, and be able to signal boost D20 Dames and How to Be More D&D in some small way on this podcast. This book has something for everyone, so I highly recommend checking it out. How to Be More D&D will be out late August 2022, and you can pick up your copy from your local bookshop. You can find links to How to Be More D&D, D20 Dames, and Kat's other work in this episode description. Thanks again, and I hope you enjoy. We'll just start off really nice and simply. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
Of course. I'm Kat Kruger. Let's see, what do I do? I'm a freelance narrative game designer at my own company, Steampunk Unicorn Studio. I do freelance game design for companies like, I've worked for Hasbro, Wizards of the Coast, Larian, all sorts of like third-party D&D publishers. I'm also an author. I've written a number of young adult novels. I have a series and a movie adaptation. And I'm also the dungeon master at D20 Dames, which is an actual play D&D family-friendly podcast.
Look at that resume. Incredible. Yeah, because you've got over 10 years experience of doing this sort of thing, haven't you? So,
yeah.
Like, how did you get into, like, writing in general? I guess that's the place to start, because I assume then game design comes a little bit later as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I have pretty much always known that I've wanted to be a writer. I think my story starts with reading those Little Mr. books, Little Mr. Happy.
The Mr. Men and Little Mrs. Yeah.
Little Mr. Yeah, Mr. Men books. My story starts there, where I read that book and I thought, this is so cool. And I realized that people actually get paid to write books like that. Mm-hmm, and after that realization happened, I just started sort of writing my own little stories. I had I recruited my little sister to do illustrations for an literal in-house newspaper with a print run of one.
Hey, it's a limited edition, I think you'll find.
So I started there, and I did a lot of like home projects of that sort. And then I got into, I think it was grade 3, I went to a Scholastic book fair, and they had Code Your Own Text Adventure book. So I got into coding that, and then I started writing my own text adventures, which I coded as well. And then, throughout junior high and high school, I did a lot of theater and playwriting. And then I sort of like fell off of the writing track because I didn't know what my future really was, because being an author is not something that you're generally able to do without having other jobs. Yeah. And that is where I found myself struggling. So I did a lot of novel writing in my free time as I was working various other non-writing related jobs.
Essential jobs, but not that it doesn't allow you to thrive per se, but it allows you to survive.
Yes, exactly. And eventually I got fed up with, low wages, inability to be in a work environment that I really enjoyed. And so I went back to school and got a degree in public relations, which is a different kind of writing. And at about a week before I graduated from university, I got a job at the Canadian Broadcasting Company Corporation. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And I got a job there as a sort of like an arts journalist / social media producer at a time when social media didn't even really have a name. I worked there for a number of years. And while I was working there, I worked on my first novel, which was a werewolf, urban fantasy, sci-fi sort of trilogy. It wound up being a trilogy. I entered it into a competition on the east coast of Canada, and it wound up winning. Then I thought, okay, maybe I can make a go of this. We'll see.
Yeah.
And it actually it did pretty well. Like the rights sold to Random House in Germany, so I got a 3-book deal there, along with a small print run in Canada and the US. After that, I was invited as a guest to HalCon Science Fiction and Fantasy Convention in Halifax, where I was living at the time in Canada. And I was assigned a personal assistant, and she happened to also be the personal assistant of a guest from Wizards of the Coast, who was the program specialist for Dungeons and Dragons. At which point we met at a social in the evening, and we talked about Dungeons and Dragons and how, although I devoured all the Dragonlance books as a tween, I had never played the game. And so his job at the convention was to teach people how to play, because 5th edition was coming out. So he put together a tutorial for the next day, played it. I absolutely loved the game. And it was just an hour and a half, and it just blew my mind, all the storytelling potential of D&D. And I ran with it. I got a starter set. I started to DM a home game. I started teaching at a youth creative learning institute for youth. And I started teaching creative writing through Dungeons and Dragons. And then eventually I just ran Dungeons and Dragons for them. And then the following year, Chris, he came back, and I came back as a guest at HalCon, and we hit it off in a different way. And that is our little meet cute that I talk about at the start of How to Be D&D.
I know.
How to Be More D&D.
It's again, and you've said, like, obviously that you and obviously no shame in it at all, like coming to a game like this later on in life, because I feel like sometimes there is like maybe this persona, or there's this view of it, like, oh, we look at all these young people in early things, like enjoying themselves, but I too was someone who came to it late as well, and it's like that light bulb moment going, oh, it's not just calculators. It's not just, it's not this negative, in quotation marks, view of it. So I totally appreciate you when you were just like, yeah, it just works, as it just sort of opens up to you. And like an hour and a half, that's all it takes, isn't it? To suddenly just like, it's your new obsession is not the right word, but your new passion, right? So yeah, getting into it. So I completely appreciate it, because the same thing happened to me, just coming to it later. Then a couple of years down the line, I have 2 podcasts related to role-playing games because of that storytelling potential.
Yeah.
So just going back to your writing in general then, so where do you look for inspiration when you're, I know obviously we'll go on to How to Be More D&D, but when you're writing or thinking of adventures to run, where are you looking for inspiration?
A lot of the times it's pop culture. I'm a big fan of, Marvel and Star Wars and, a lot of pop culture movies. And I think that when I write some of my adventures, it's drawn from that. It's also drawn from a lot of world mythology. I particularly have a fascination with like fairy tales and fractured fairy tales. So when you see a lot of my work on the DM's Guild, there's quite a lot of inspiration from world mythologies. But if you look at my work with D20 Dames, especially at the live shows that we do, it's generally based on some sort of pop culture reference. I've done everything from Fast and the Furious to Untitled Goose Game. Like,
oh, amazing.
Yeah, it's just like whatever I think would be a fun, hat tip to something that I think is easy to understand for the general population. I think it's a fun way of having a live show because we don't have any expectation that people coming to the live show know who D20 Dames are and have followed the podcast throughout. So, having these little like touch points of, a movie or a video game or something else that people can just really easily latch onto. I think that's really fun.
Yeah. And as well, like for me, something that's very unique about sort of the way you play and the way you DM as well is that, again, not advertise, but you sort of present yourself as a family friendly show and stuff like that. And I find really interesting because a lot of Dungeons and Dragons games and streams aren't necessarily friendly to young adults or children, but obviously lots of children do watch it. So I'm guessing that was a very conscious choice. And what do you do to make your shows family friendly? What do you keep at the forefront of your mind when you're DMing, I guess?
It is really interesting because when we first started off, we thought we were going to be like the Rat Queens. I don't know if you're familiar with that graphic.
I love the Rat Queens, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So Jen Vaughn and I got together and we had this idea where it was going to be very Rat Queens, like rough and tumble, femme, and they curse a lot. There's a lot of violence. But then we got the group together. And one of the very early conversations we had was, well, this is going to go onto podcast sites like iTunes. Do we want the explicit tag on it or not? We decided no. And that completely changed how we played. And from that moment on, we made a very conscious effort to make it family friendly. For the first campaign, the Good Fortune campaign, which just came to an end after 4 years.
4 years,
a while ago.
Incredible. Yeah. Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. So that one there, I think is probably more PG to PG-13 if we're looking at like movie and that sort of rating, because I think we were still trying to, we said it was family friendly, but we didn't really like think about in rating terms like what the content would be. We knew like swearing was out, and that we wouldn't have a lot of adult situations, but they still do. The characters are legal drinking age, so they go to taverns and have beverages, and some of the content can be a little bit I guess scary for very young children. But when we moved on to the new Wanderleaf campaign, which just started in June of this year, we sat down and we said, we want this to be kid friendly, not just family friendly. We want it also to be new learner friendly. And that changed the dynamic a little bit as well. It's we still have a lot of the heart of D20 Dames in there. It's just, we're very much more aware that we're not going to have, drinking as part of it. There's not going to be as like there was some elements of like horror in the first campaign,
of course,
and it's not going to be as dark.
Just going from that family friendly aspect and then now you're into the kid friendly stuff. I think that was sort of in the era, if you don't mind saying, of the rise of Session Zero. Whereas I think beforehand we hadn't really spoken about it until recently. And it's what I assume and still do to an extent, and I'm trying to unlearn it myself, is that family friendly is no swearing. But as you rightly pointed out, it's not going to taverns all the time, not being in adult situations, getting rid of the horror and aspect of it as well. So the fact you've made it sort of so customizable. One thing I do want to say on your new campaign, Wanderleaf, that I love how you top and tail each episode with an explanation of rules, because that is such an important thing that is missing from so many RPG streams in general, not just D&D. Like, it's all very well, you're like, you roll a dice, but what does that mean? Yeah. Even just talking about the main dice mechanic, that, hey, they're going to roll a d20 and then they're going to add modifiers. And at the end as well, so in case if people have forgotten if it's a long session, it's so useful. And I think a lot of streams and streamers don't do that because there's an assumption that people will have this knowledge. Whereas, as you said, people can pick up on it, but you need to signpost it there. So I that's a big kudos to you and your team. But I assume that comes from your communication skills and background as well. You're like, we need to communicate this at least 7 times so that people actually get what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's part public relations, but I think it's also part like having a preschooler And, being at an age where he's starting to, he's got like full sentences and is enjoying numbers. And I foresee D&D or some sort of game
course.
in his future. And I think the timing of that is it just worked really well, because I feel like part of it is like, well, how do we help new learners, and how do we actually help young kids understand what's going on when somebody says they're rolling a D20? Or, recently we talked about what actions are. And, I'm very thankful that it's being appreciated. I appreciate the kind words that you just said about it, because it was, I don't know if it was a risk, but it was, something that, like you say, it hasn't been done. And if it hasn't been done before, we're sort of like trying out this new space, and is it working? Is it too much information? So we tried to find a good balance. And the feedback that we're getting has been really positive, and I'm really glad that we gave it a try.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? Because again, exactly what you said, like you say, oh, well, the standard D&D stream or RPG stream is this, and it has to look like this, and it has to work like this, because that's what the audience is expecting. And yeah, any change like that, you're worrying that you're going to lose people, stuff like that. But I come from a content creation background myself for a university, and my God, it is, when I have to tell people like, hey, your hour-long lecture, no one's watching that anymore. You have to chunk it. You have to do little bits of intros, and it's really easy. You just need to. It's just a little bit more planning up the front. But but people are scared. People don't want to take the risk of that. I've always done it like this, and I've had no complaints. And it's like, yes, because nobody's watched it. So there's no complaints in that. Let's get to the heart of this matter then. Let's talk about how to be more D&D, which my little book finally arrived, which I was very, very excited for.
Oh, wonderful.
What is How to Be More D&D, and why should folks check it out?
How to Be More D&D is basically, it's a book for fans of D&D, whether you've played it or not. And it's written with both humor and a lot of research. It's sort of like a self-help book. So I think a lot of self-help readers would find value in this as well. But it has a little bit of a different twist, because it's how to approach life using the skills that you have from D&D. And it's also about finding a sense of adventure in your life. And I think, more specifically, I can talk about, like I've got things in the book, like rolling for random acts of kindness. That is something that is, it's a movement that many people take part in. But if you don't know where to start, I thought, random table, roll a D20.
Yeah, wizards love their tables, don't they? From every single book. Yeah, it's a fascinating, very easy to read, and very, wonderful. Like you said, incredibly well written as well. And again, I know obviously you've got your story peppered throughout it as well. And I think for me, when I was reading it, it really enshrined what I love about D&D, and like what I want to get across to people, not just with this podcast, but when I talk to people, when I go see my other adult friends who aren't into role-playing games. Because again, it feels like a book that is for people who feel that they've maybe missed out on the D&D hype per se, and they're not so sure. And being saying like this, you can transfer skills. I mean, I know that's a lot of like work talk going, oh, if you do this, you can do it in work, and you can transfer these skills and stuff. But there's so much of this, like comparing the elements of D&D and how it can enhance parts of your life, not a one-to-one translation, like I know what you say about. It's simple things like, what I appreciate with this book is obviously you've split it up into 4 parts. One about sort of the general sort of stuff, the player classes, and the adventuring. Like I love the one of the titles was like when adventure comes knocking, and I'm like, oh, so true. But I think one of my favorite parts of it is the part about being the DM of your own life. It's one thing I find, and maybe you find it as well, is that when I talk to other dungeon masters and other game masters, sometimes they are the forever DM, they are the forever GM, because a lot of players are worried and scared that if they do it, if they try it, they can't go back, and they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the capacity to do it. So I quite appreciate how you obviously cover the player stuff. They're like, hey, why don't you chance it and try and be more of a DM? And because you do it so well, because it's about, is that taking charge and taking like the reins and just getting a little bit out of your comfort zone. You don't have to go all the way. So I really appreciate the splitting up of the book in that way.
Yeah, it was very helpful to have a publisher and editor who worked very closely with me on coming up with the outline for the book. A lot of that is thanks to her.
So when you were approached to write this book, then where did you start? Like, because obviously you sort of got the structure, so to say, and you said you did a little bit of research for it. So where did you look for research when doing this particular book?
Well, after we came up with the outline, I did a lot of, like I said, I have a degree in public relations, so a lot of my education was in social studies. So I drew a lot from communication styles. Was a big part of it, because I think with D&D, communication is really key, and I think in real life, communication is also pretty key. So that was one of the areas that I tried to focus on, and just like general social studies on like person-to-person interaction and that sort of thing. And I think also I looked at, I tried to find a really fun way of encapsulating class personalities, and then how class personalities interact with each other. And I wound up doing a lot of research in horoscopes. So I tried to like map it all out so that each player class is sort of similar in a lot of ways to horoscope zodiac signs.
Yeah, you sort of go through and say like, well, these are the classes that are compatible with you, but there are some that aren't compatible with you, and to map that onto other people, it might be that you are too similar or you're too opposite. Which I was like, oh, that's so true. And it's interesting again, that communication style stuff you're talking about, so like that, aggressive, affirmative, passive, and passive aggressive. Man, I wish the whole of the like Reddit, the D&D forum, read that section, because I think a lot of their problems, like, oh, this player said this, and like, if you've read this book and then just like everyone's going to be affirmative and stop being passive aggressive or aggressive, and then problems are solved.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things. Even when I was looking back at it, I was like, I should really take note of this for myself, because it's easy to fall into some of the communication traps if you don't practice it. And if you're not like conscious of the decisions that you make sometimes.
Especially, I guess, as well, because now we're in a sort of weird hybrid sort of thing. So like many people playing online, some people might be going back to playing in person. And being online, you can miss so many non-verbal cues as well. So having to be like, okay, I need to be over communicating to an extent to like be that affirmative stuff, because otherwise people won't know and stuff. So I just felt that communication section was actually, I was like, oh, this is so important. I need to, again, I put a big note in it going, use this for the next game. Just like, do you have a particular favorite section that you enjoyed writing, or a particular exercise? Because quite a lot of the book, you have little sidebars, little like almost like mini quests. Like you mentioned one before, sort of rolling for support, which I know was the sort of the vibe by sort of the 80s animated sort of classes coming through. And my particular favorite, which I'm going to just take from you already, is Tasha's sort of agony aunt, because I was like, yes, of course she would have a voice in this. And I would love her as my aunt. She'd probably not be entirely helpful, but her voice was so beautiful in this.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you said that, because that actually is my favorite part. Yes. That was so fun to write. And I sort of felt like, when I was talking to my publisher about it, I said, do you think we can use the 80s characters for this sidebar? And then can we use Tasha's? And it all had to get vetted through Wizards, because it's their IP. So she just said, go for it. And, worst case is it doesn't get published. So
get in and you just have it for yourself. Oh no.
But they were happy with it. And I was happy that they were happy with it. So the Tasha's, I actually wish I could have been able to squeeze in a few more of those sidebars, because they were so fun to write.
Yeah, I felt like this is a column coming up at some point, whether you do it independently of Wizards or not. I would love to see like a weekly column from Tasha's, because she's such an iconic character anyway. She's obviously, as she's been brought back in the last couple of years, even though she's always been around. And she's just so cool. And now they've got rid of that sort of like, evil stuff. Like in general, she's like just a badass. And we need more badass women, femme presenting people in general. So to have her commenting on your problems, but also solving them, but also
solving quote unquote, like air quotes.
Yeah, exactly. Which I loved. I know this is now going very, very niche, and I appreciate the book's not coming out for a little bit at time of recording, but I loved like the first one was like, I'm an IT person, but in real life, but I want to be a barbarian. And Tasha's like, well, I was also once an it girl. And I'm just like, oh, amazing. Because now I can just visualize this very well-rounded character, and like, oh, she doesn't get it, but you know what? It doesn't matter. She's Aunt Tasha. She's weird Aunt Tasha, and I don't mind that. you said about because you've got quite a few tables, including the random acts of kindness one, but you also included random acts of sort of self-kindness as well.
Yes.
And that's something I haven't seen before. And you do focus on a little bit about self-care, and that obviously I know the quote of like self-care is a free action and stuff like that. And it's interesting because you do talk about, because D&D and most RPG games, there are collaborative storytelling things. And you there's a great quote again, you said that D&D ultimately is about friendship. But a lot of times, sometimes it's very hard to meet like-minded people, certainly if you're getting older, like meeting people with hobbies and stuff. And that idea of like the solo adventurer, and you can do stuff and you can say, but what if you go to the bookstore and you ask the person at the bookstore, hey, do you have a club or stuff like that? And just those little things to sort of branch out. Again, it just felt it's such a small thing, but it's actually, I had thought to myself, I was like, without the people I'm with now doing the role playing and doing the D&D, I'd actually find it really hard to make friends. So I just thought that was just really interesting how D&D is, to make friends, you have to sort of push yourself out a little bit, but taking those little steps. And it just was interesting the way you sort of, that act of self-kindness, be kind to yourself. You should also push yourself out a little bit of your comfort zones. I just thought that was a really nice little balance you did there.
I think part of it was really helpful. One of the helpful things about being in the middle of a pandemic is that you start thinking about things like this, like how important self-care is. And because I wrote this book, in the midst of it last year, in the spring of last year. And it was an important point, but I think it's also having taught D&D and seeing how remarkable it is as a social tool, as a healing tool, as a tool that, can help people find their voices. I wanted to somehow bring that into this book. And I think the self-care part is where I found that.
Really very unique thing, I think. I haven't seen any other self-guides or self-help books that do that to this extent. That in each chapter, obviously, you talk about some aspect of sort of a player sheet. And at the end of it, you have this sort of fill out your player sheet as you are now, which is very scary when you're like, oh no. But I think it's again, it's that self-reflection stuff. Like, you go through it and there's like, okay, you've read about this now apply it to yourself. And I just thought, I appreciate, like the design of it is beautiful. But I just thought that that's such a cool way of just like enhancing and sort of going over that learning. So we are putting in practice and just having a think and sitting with it. And again, another quote that that sitting with that disappointment before saying now what and moving on. And so I just lots of little things like that peppered throughout. I thought that was just really interesting. And I hadn't seen that character or that sort of self-reflection that's sort of like a full-on character sheet or something like that, but it was tied with every chapter. It was really interesting.
Yeah, that was something I think we came to a little bit later as I was writing it. It just made sense that, you're writing a D&D sort of self-help book. And if you're the character in your life, then you need a character sheet. And how does that apply to all these other chapters? And just very fortunate to have a publisher and, designer, Wizards of the Coast, just being so on board with doing things that are a little bit outside the box. And I really appreciate like the confluence of all of that.
Yeah, I can imagine a more stringent RPG, like maybe IP would be like, no, you have to do it in this comical style, etc. But that's the one thing, again, with your writing, not only is it easy to read, but there is definitely a heart in there. The way you sort of describe the different bits about like, hey, go out of your comfort zone, but also burnout is a thing. Take unpaid medical leave. I was like, oh, amazing. And that just that almost normalizing mental health stuff in a way that I feel is very much like, again, that easy read, but also it is in D&D elements and quotation marks, but it's just like, oh, this makes sense. Again, having that transition between like, here's what it could be in D&D terms, but like, how do you give that to your normal life, and making sure you have those long rests, making sure that, you take time for yourself and those sort of like little self-pursuits and stuff. What part of the book did you find the most challenging to write? Which I know is a very horrible, hard question. Was there any part that you were like, you struggled on just because you couldn't find the right words, or you were struggling to find inspiration on as well?
It probably would have been an easier book to write if I had just been completely tongue-in-cheek about everything.
Fair enough.
However, so I guess the challenging part was that, I wanted there to be real actionable content throughout the book, and not just to sort of have the tongue-in-cheek advice from someone who is in the D&D community. That was the biggest challenge of like doing all the hard research to find the social studies touch points that I could bring in from communications and interpersonal relations, and then, mapping it, not one-to-one, like we've said, to D&D. So it was sort of, that was the challenge. I also, because I don't really follow zodiacs really closely, I had to do deep dive into horoscopes and sort of see, like, bring out the aspects of each of the classes and see how I could work with that as sort of like a guidepost. So those are probably the most challenging aspects. Like, I didn't want this to be a fluff book.
and it certainly is not at all. Again, I know I keep giving you positive praise, which I appreciate, can be incredibly awkward, but I think for me, because it was such an easy read, like I reread this again this morning, and it's like 150 pages.
Oh my gosh!
But that shows to me, as someone who does create content, that a lot of work went into this to make it that easy read, so that people could pick it up and like read the chapter and be like, oh, I learned something, and have an actual thing, and not worry about like how often all these sentences got rewritten, how this chapter got revised, all that sort of thing. And it is an absolute skill for any writer to be able to do something like that. And I guess maybe that's something, again, you talked before about when you wrote for young adult novels as well. I know they have a certain style to make it easy to read as well, so maybe there's that in as well. But yeah, I when I read it, I was like, it makes sense. I've read it in an hour and a half. That there's some skill here that I will never possess in any
oh my
form.
Gosh! Thank you.
So I can only imagine how much love and effort and blood and sweat and tears went into this book. So no, I appreciate it. So what to you then is sort of the most important elements of good game design or good writing, whether it is writing for D&D or just writing in general?
I think, like, if I was going to come at it from a very general writing tip, it would be being as concise as possible. And I think that is the one course that I am so thankful that I had in all of my public relations education, was actually the journalistic writing class, because you have so few words to get across sometimes very big concepts. I think that is the thing that really helped my writing. It helped me write my first book. It helped me write for game design, whether it's D&D or board games. It's always something that I come back to, and it's, be as concise as possible. And when it comes to game design, like, it's really important to be able to get rules across without being confusing. And personally, as a game player, my eyes glaze over if I see too many rules in front of me.
Oh yeah. When it's the small writing in several columns on a big A2 bit, and you're like, no, okay, someone else could read this and tell me what's being said.
Just can we just start?
I just want to. I've rolled. What does that mean? Yeah. I know that feeling.
Yeah. So for game design, I think that that's where I've applied it, and for writing, I feel like, be as concise as possible. And then when you want to write something a little bit more flowery, then it stands out.
What is the key message you want readers to take away from How to Be More D&D, would you say?
I think it's really simply, here is a tool to help you find adventure in your life.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah, you just talked about conciseness and you just did it in a sentence. I'm like, yeah, there's the pro at work there. No, and I completely agree. So what are your plans for the future? Do you have any other projects in the works just now that you can talk about? I appreciate you've just had a book published. So you're like, I'm done. Please don't ask me any more stuff. But out of interest, like, are you taking it as a bit of a break now, or are you jumping into the next thing?
I do have some NDAs, but the things that I could talk about, like, I'm currently working on Divinity Original Sin, the board game.
Very exciting.
Yes. So I've been working on that for a while. It's a project that's wrapping up in the next couple of months. So that's pretty much been occupying most of my time for freelance game design. But I'm also working on, Betrayal at House on the Hill, 3rd edition just came out. It came out in Europe earlier this year, but in North America, I think it was shown at Gen Con.
Gen Con, I think, just gone. So hopefully the rest of America can get it.
Yeah, that was very, very fun to work on. I'm also working for, I have a couple of freelance projects with Matt Colville's organization. So I have some monsters in Flea Mortals, which was funded on Kickstarter.
Yes. Exciting
very excited
stuff.
about
Congrats.
that.
That's so exciting.
Yeah, and I've got something I'm working on for Arcadia magazine again. So I worked with them before Monsters of Wonderland, which was I think it was in issue 13 that came out earlier this year. And then D20 Dames is sort of an ongoing. We just did an online show for Gen Con.
Gen Con, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Again, you're just plowing through them. You're like, I've just got all these projects on the go. That again is very inspiring. But I'm sure you are taking breaks and having some rest as well. Well, thank you so much, Kat. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and just geek out about your wonderful book and about D&D in general, and the power of storytelling and this idea of collaboration. And it doesn't matter what age you come to it, there's always a spot for you at the table. So where can we find your work if you're on social media, and where can we get, and when will it be out, I guess, How to Be More D&D?
Sure. The book comes out on August 23rd, available at pretty much any bookseller, and you can find me at steampunkunicornstudio.com, which is where I do my freelance work. And on socials, I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Kat Kruger, KATKRUGER.
Well, thank you so much, Kat. Like I said, it's definitely one of those books I'm going to definitely keep by me and have a quick read every so often, because I think there's so many little tips in there. I recommend it to anyone who's interested in D&D, like you said, whether they're a veteran or brand new to it, just to try it out, because it encapsulates everything that we need in D&D, and more people should know about it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was really lovely chatting with you.